If you think the Wild West was only dust, gun smoke, and lonely sunsets, think again. Because sometimes out there on the edge of nowhere, fate puts two wounded hearts on the same trail. This is the true tale of a cowboy who thought he'd spend another Christmas alone, until a widowed Apache neighbor opened her door and changed the rest of his life. Before we ride into this unforgettable story, make sure you subscribe, share, and drop a comment to let us know you're here for more frontier romance. Saddle up, settle in, and let's start this story. Snow drifted lightly across the Arizona plains the morning John Calder heard the sound that changed everything. It was a sharp, wild cry carried on the cold wind, the kind that makes a lone man stop in his tracks and listen twice. John had been mending the south fence of his homestead, the wire stiff under his gloves, when the distant echo of a distressed horse reached him again. He straightened slowly, scanning the horizon. The land stretched wide and empty, the kind of emptiness a man could lose his soul in, but there, far off near the ridge, thin smoke curled upward in a frantic, broken pattern. Something was wrong. John swung onto his horse without another thought and kicked into a gallop, the frostbitten ground crunching beneath hooves. As he rode closer, he recognized the adobe home of his Apache neighbor, Hiana. She lived a mile and a half from him, close enough to see smoke in the sky yet far enough that conversations were rare. Their worlds had brushed edges but never blended. Still, the sight of her mare bucking and thrashing inside a collapsed section of her corral made his pulse lurch painfully. Gianna was pulling desperately at the reins, her boots digging into the frozen soil as she murmured calm words the frightened animal no longer understood. He leapt off the saddle before his horse stopped moving. The winter air cut sharp against his face as he approached. Gianna didn't flinch or turn in surprise. She simply glanced at him with a flash of relief so brief he might have imagined it. The mare's leg was stuck between two snapped planks, trembling with fear. John crouched low, speaking in slow, steady tones as he pressed his shoulder under the wooden beam. Snow crackled beneath his boots as he pushed upward with all the strength months of ranch work had carved into him. Gianna steadied the mare's head, whispering in the musical cadence of her language. Together, they freed the horse with one final groan of wood. The mare stumbled but didn't fall. Gianna stroked her neck until the tremors eased. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice quiet yet strong. "I could have managed, but she might have injured herself before I did." John shook his head, watching her hands move with gentle precision. "You called out without meaning to," he said. "Or maybe I just heard what others wouldn't." A faint smile touched her lips, gone almost before it formed. Behind them, her young son Tahoma peeked from the doorway, wide-eyed but curious. Gianna called something softly to him in Apache, her voice shifting to a warm, maternal tone that softened the morning's tension. The wind swept sharply across the yard, carrying the scent of cedar smoke and winter sage. Gianna brushed a stray braid back from her cheek and met John's gaze again. "You should step inside a moment, warm yourself. I made bread this morning." Her invitation was simple, sincere, without hesitation. John wasn't accustomed to being asked anywhere. Solitude had become his closest companion since he'd carved out his homestead. But the look in her eyes held no expectation, only an unspoken recognition of shared loneliness. He nodded. "I'd appreciate that." Inside, her home radiated warmth in a way John hadn't felt in years. Thick woven blankets decorated the walls, each threaded with colors that told stories he didn't yet know. The fire burned steadily in a corner hearth, filling the room with the earthy scent of pinon wood. Tahoma approached cautiously with a wooden toy horse in hand. John knelt, turning the small carving over with deliberate admiration. "Fine workmanship," he said. Tahoma's shy smile widened before he darted back toward the fire. Gianna placed fresh bread and a small pot of honey on the table. John sat across from her, the heat of the hearth brushing his chilled skin. They ate quietly, letting the silence settle between them. When she finally spoke, her words were soft but carried weight. "Snow comes early this year," she said. "Hard winter follows early snow." John nodded, finishing the last piece of bread. "I've felt it too, the land, been restless." Something about the way she looked at him then made him feel seen in a way he hadn't realized he'd missed. As he stood to leave, Gianna reached forward lightly and touched his sleeve. Nothing firm, just a wisp of contact, yet enough to bring him still. "Christmas is soon," she said. "You should not spend it alone. Come here that day, share a meal with us." The wind rattled faintly outside, but the warmth of her voice settled deep in his ribs. John swallowed, searching her gaze. I would like that. Her fingers slipped away gently. Good, she said simply. The days until Christmas dragged with unusual heaviness. John carried out his ranch chores with muscle memory alone, his mind drifting toward her home more often than he admitted. He found himself glancing at the horizon at random moments, imagining her moving through her daily routines with the grace he'd only glimpsed. When Christmas morning finally came, a thin shimmer of frost blanketed the land. The pale sunrise stretched long across the mesas as John prepared his horse, hands steady but heart strangely restless. He carried 2 small bundles, a wooden horse he'd carved for Tahoma and a length of red cloth he'd bought from the trading post for Yana. He rode toward her home through the crisp stillness, the air sharp but not unfriendly. Smoke rose from her chimney in a smooth, steady line this time, a sign of calm, comfort, steadiness. When he dismounted, Yana was outside placing cedar branches near the doorway. She looked up at him, the faintest smile blooming across her face. You came, she said. I wouldn't be anywhere else, he replied, and meant it. Inside, the warmth welcomed him instantly. She had prepared a simple but thoughtful meal, rabbit roasted with herbs, warm corn cakes, a pot of spiced tea. Tahoma lit up at the sight of the wooden horse, immediately racing it across the floor. Yana unfolded the red cloth slowly, brushing her fingers across the fabric. This color, she murmured. My husband loved this color. John's breath caught. I didn't mean to bring any pain. She shook her head gently. No, it brings memory. And memory is not always sorrow. They ate together, shared stories in low voices, and for the first time in years, John felt the cold inside him finally begin to thaw. As firelight danced across the room, Yana looked at him with quiet, unspoken understanding. Something in that look felt like the beginning of a path he had never dared to walk. The fire crackled gently as evening settled over the small adobe home, painting the walls in shades of amber and soft gold. John sat with his hands wrapped around a warm cup of spiced tea, but his focus wasn't on the drink. Yana moved quietly around the room, tending to small tasks with the fluid grace of someone who understood the rhythm of her home as well as she understood her own heartbeat. Every now and then she glanced at him, and every time she did, his chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years, anticipation mixed with a strange, quiet peace. Tahoma eventually grew sleepy, curling up near the fire with his new wooden horse clasped in his hands. Yana covered him with a woven blanket, smoothing his hair with a tenderness that made John's throat ache. When she rose again, she didn't return to her seat. Instead, she stood near the hearth, watching the flames shift and dance. You have a heavy heart, she said softly, still facing the fire. It has carried many winters alone. John hesitated, then set his cup aside. Losing people does that, he said. You start believing it's safer not to let anyone close. She turned to him, her eyes deep with understanding. And yet, you are here. He exhaled slowly. And yet I'm here. Yana stepped closer, the soft rustle of her clothing the only sound in the quiet home. She knelt beside him, her gaze searching his as though she were looking not at him, but into him. When my husband died, she said, part of my spirit went with him. For a long time, I believed I would walk alone for the rest of my life. She placed her hand lightly over her heart. But the land teaches us something. Grief is a season. It comes like winter, cold, endless, unforgiving. But no winter stays forever. John's breath trembled. I don't know if I remember how to let spring back in. Yana gave him a small, steady smile, then let it come slowly. Her fingers brushed his cheek, warm, gentle, grounding. He leaned into her touch without thinking, the instinct feeling old and familiar, as though he'd been waiting for this moment without realizing it. She moved closer until their foreheads nearly touched. The space between them felt sacred, fragile, and inevitable. John whispered her name. Yana, if you want me here, truly want me, say it. She didn't hesitate. I want you here. The firelight flickered across their faces as their lips met, softly at first, a question half asked, half answered. Then the kiss deepened, slow and certain, like two paths finally merging. Her hands slipped around his shoulders, his arms circled her waist, and the world outside faded to nothing more than cold wind and distant silence. Hours passed gently, naturally. They moved together with a tenderness born not of hunger, but of long-buried longing, of hearts tired of surviving in solitude. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. Only warmth shared under woven blankets, the glow of dying embers and whispered breaths in the soft dark. When night settled fully, she lay with her head against his chest, her hand resting over his heart as if memorizing its rhythm. John held her close, not out of passion, but out of a deep, aching need to keep this moment from slipping away. The faint light of dawn came softly, touching the room with pale silver before either of them stirred. Yana woke first, her eyelashes fluttering before she lifted her gaze to him. "You should leave for your chores," she murmured gently, though her fingers traced idle circles over his ribs, "but come back after." John smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "If you want me to, I'll always come back." "I do," she whispered. He dressed quietly and stepped outside into the chilly morning air. The land, wide and endless, seemed somehow less empty than it had before. John stood for a moment beside his horse, staring at the thin plume of smoke rising from her chimney. Something in him, something long frozen, had thawed in the warmth of her home. That day marked the beginning of a new rhythm. When his chores were done, John returned to Yana's home. Some days he repaired her fencing or hauled water from the nearby creek. Other days he simply sat with her, listening as she shared stories of her people, tales of stars that guided travelers, of spirits that walked the desert in moonlight, of strength found in silence. Tahoma followed him everywhere, tugging at his coat, asking endless questions, beaming whenever John lifted him onto a horse. The weeks turned into months, and the land shifted from winter's pale hush to the early breath of spring. The thawing earth felt like a reflection of John's own heart. He felt lighter, steadier. For the first time since burying his past, he felt a future forming quietly beside him. One warm afternoon, after repairing a section of her roof, John found Ayana sitting on a rock overlooking the open plains. Tahoma played nearby, laughing as he chased lizards between the brush. John sat beside her, the sunlight warming his back. "The land is changing," Ayana said. "Spring will be strong this year." He nodded. "I feel it too." She turned toward him, brushing her fingers over the calluses on his hands. "You have changed too," he chuckled softly. "For the better, I hope. For who you are meant to be," she replied. He reached into his coat then, clearing his throat as nerves tightened his jaw. "I made something for you," he said, "not sure if it's much, but it's honest." He held out a small cottonwood carving, two hands clasped together, simple but carefully shaped. She traced the carving slowly, reverently. "This is us?" she asked. "If you want it to be." Her eyes lifted to his, warm, certain. "I think it already is." She took his hand then, interlacing her fingers with his in the exact shape of the carving. The gesture was small, but it settled something deep inside him, a promise spoken without words. Behind them, Tahoma called out excitedly, waving his wooden horse in the air. Yana laughed softly, leaning her head against John's shoulder. In that quiet moment, the vast Wild West didn't feel wild at all. It felt like home. The story didn't begin in thunder or fire, nor did it end in some grand spectacle. It grew the way things were meant to grow in the frontier, slowly, honestly, like roots finding water beneath hard earth. A widowed Apache woman, a lonely cowboy, both carrying loss, both learning to breathe again. And somewhere between winter's sorrow and spring's first bloom, they found each other. Sometimes love doesn't come with a shout. Sometimes it comes with a knock on the heart, so gentle you almost miss it. But when you answer, everything changes. And for John and Ayana, that Christmas night was the knock that opened a lifetime.